last week. And so I'm going to go from chapter 6 and verse 41. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and he said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, that's between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought he was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him and ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages and cities, a countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, you know, if you were a child of the 1980s and the 1990s like I was, you probably know what this is. What is it? Magic Eye. Magic Eye. Sounds much better in your accent. Magic Eye. Now, I was told by at least 1 or 2 individuals that this was witchcraft, and you really shouldn't look at these, because they'll taint your soul. They won't. It's just like, it's a stereogram. It's a 3D picture. It's just very clever. Now, up there, it's going to be a bit difficult for you to see because the resolution's a bit low, but like the little monitor back there, if you really fancy yourself, you can probably get it. But then I got these as well. Now, can anyone see? This is a bit of a quiz. You have to kind of look just beyond it. You have to kind of squint. I'm trying to hold it as steady as I can. Can you see it yet? Can you see yet? Who fancies themselves as good at these? Oh, come on then.
It's a heart inside a circle.
Oh, well done. It's a heart inside a circle. Now, this next one, don't make me have to go back to Liam again. This one's a bit more rewarding. It's harder to see, but it's a bit more rewarding. Is it the glare? Okay, if I tilt it like that, does that help? Okay. Can you see yet? Am I going to have to rely on Liam again? What is it? Well, that's all right. It is an elephant. Hey, well done. Now, the last one, I'm almost, I feel like I'm going to give up on this one because this one's very difficult. It's very hard, this one. It's what? Plates. No, is it Jesus? Unfortunately, do you know what, Chris? I did look for one, and I couldn't find one. So there's a moon there, and then there's some planets, and then there's a little rocket ship just about there. Now, you can try them later if you want, right? Just to prove that I'm not lying. But the thing is, when we read Mark's Gospel, it feels like the disciples are looking at a magic eye picture of Jesus. And when you guys are sat there like this, right? And I wish I could have taken a picture of you because you're all there like this. And I'm straining really hard, but I still can't see it. Mark's Gospel is very much like this. You're looking at the disciples, and they're kind of straining hard, and they're squinting, and they're looking just beyond him, but it doesn't feel like they quite get it. And when you think about the story so far, just over the last few weeks, the disciples have been on a mission trip. They've experienced such success. They were given authority by Jesus to heal the sick and to drive out demons and to preach the good news, and they saw people repent and turn and follow Jesus. And then they were exhausted after that. And so it's almost like Jesus says to them, come away by yourselves to a quiet place and rest a while. He's going to take them on a spa break, a a little retreat to kind of rest their souls afterwards. But then this gets scuppered by this pesky crowd that turns up of 5,000 men. And like, you've got 5,000 men. How many women and children have you got as well? That's a huge crowd. And this crowd are following them. And Jesus, instead of being upset by the fact that his plans for a spa break with the disciples have been ruined, he looks at the crowd, and it says that he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus wanted to be their shepherd. And so he called them and he started teaching them. And he was teaching them about his kingdom. He was teaching them that blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Like, we don't know that from Mark's gospel. We can pretty much guess that that's what he was teaching them, because that's the kind of thing that he taught. He taught them what his kingdom is like. And time went on and they were all starving. And the disciples came to him and said, but all of these people are starving. How are we going to feed them? And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. And rather than remembering that they've just been given authority by Jesus to heal the sick and cast out demons and to preach the good news, and knowing that the one who gave them the authority is in front of them, immediately they think, where are we going to get the money from to feed these people? They're all going to starve. And they dive straight to the practical conclusion. But then 5 loaves and 2 fish in the hands of Jesus becomes a feast for thousands. And he is revealing to this crowd his true identity, if only they're willing to see it. But the disciples still need a rest. They still need this bar break. And so Jesus pops them into a boat and he sends them off on the lake. And he deals with the cleanup. He then kind of disperses the crowd, but he goes up onto a mountain to pray. And this isn't something that's just kind of incidental in the text. This isn't something that's just a little throwaway. This is part of the rhythm of Jesus' life. This is key. Jesus regularly took time away to be with his Father. And you know, if Jesus does that, how much more for us? You know, this is something that we're talking a lot about as a church. We want to grow in habits of prayer that are bringing us into regular contact with the Father, that are going to change us. And you know, we don't just come to him to ask for things and to offload our worries and our sadnesses. Yes, we get to do that, but it's so much more. Because in prayer, that's where God gives us himself. Do you think about that? He gives us himself. It's like life. It's like breath. It's like oxygen. And you know, if Jesus took that time to be with the Father, you know, how much more for us? Prayer is a place where we are transformed. We become like what we behold. You know, psychologists tell us that we've got these things in our brains. I've been reading this book. It's a very good book, which I'm not going to talk about right now, but talks about like mirror neurons, where, like, you know, in humans, when we're in relationships with one another, we spend time with one another, and we begin to kind of take on one another's characteristics. We almost mirror one another's behavior. You try it. You sit in a room. You fold you put your leg across your other leg like that, and do that. And you watch how other people start to mirror what you're doing. I'm going to stop now because I'm going to fall over. But actually, Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians that when we behold him, we become like him. As we behold him, we get transformed from one degree of glory into another. And so that time in prayer is so important, because that's where, when we behold him, we become like him. We're changed to be like him. So important. Anyway, sorry, I wasn't going to say all of that, but meanwhile, Jesus is up a mountain, and the disciples are out on the lake, and it's dark. And what we can't picture here is that the disciples are rowing across Kavartha Lake, and Jesus is sat on the little hillside just up by there, okay? Or should I say just up by there? And because the thing is, it's dark. Now, if that were the case, then the fact that Jesus saw them rowing hard against the wind wouldn't be any great shakes, would it? But the fact is, they're out in the middle of a dark lake, and he comes to them in the 4th watch of the night, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. It is pitch black, and Jesus is up a mountain, and somehow, Mark doesn't tell us, but Jesus sees that they're in trouble. And you know, I love this. I love this because what I don't want to do is to read into a text here, and yet the reality is that he sees now. And you know, if you're on a lake and you feel like you're rowing hard and you're making no headway, he sees. He sees and he cares. And he's coming, because that's what he does. He comes out onto the lake, and Jesus doesn't come in his little motorized dinghy to come and rescue them. Jesus is walking on the sea. Now, have you ever thought about this? Like, Jesus is walking on the sea. It's windy. There are waves. Does he kind of go like up a wave, down a wave, up a wave, down a wave? Like, this was real. This happened, people. Now, he's heading towards them on the water. He comes because he cares. But this isn't like, remember when we looked at the calming of the storm a few months back in chapter 4? The storm was outside. They were all in the boat with Jesus, and they were terrified by the storm. This time, they're not in threat, they're just struggling. They're not scared by the storm this time. Instead, they're scared by Jesus. Now, why? Well, it's because Jesus is walking on the sea. And, like, I don't want to state the obvious here, but have you thought about how you would react? Jesus is walking on the sea. Now, many have tried, and many have failed. Here's a moment for honesty. How many of you have tried walking on water? Did that really silly thing, you know, where they tell you not to run in swimming pools, don't they? Because the sides are slippy, you know? Well, if I get a good run up and some momentum, then surely I can get a few steps onto the water. Straight down. Because we've all failed, except for one. Because the one who created the laws of nature is not bound by the laws of nature. And you think about the laws of nature. The laws of nature are there to preserve our sanity, okay? The fact that time passes in one direction. Like, we would like it to go backwards sometimes, but aren't you grateful that it doesn't? Imagine if you woke up this morning and it was like 3 days ago. How confused would you be? Like, God has given us this law of nature that protects our sanity. What about the fact that light travels in straight lines? I mean, this is beautiful, right? So light is currently bouncing off of me and then bouncing off in straight lines into your eyes. You know, if light went in bendy lines, I could be stood behind you right now and going, hello? Now, that would be really creepy, wouldn't it? Saves our sanity. What about gravity? You got out of bed this morning and you didn't worry about whether you were going to levitate. You didn't have to put your weighted blanket on to hold you in the bed because gravity might switch off overnight. No, it didn't. It saves our sanity. And then there's buoyancy. Now, spread yourself out with your puffer jacket. You can float on water. But you can't walk on it. You cannot walk on water. Because we are bound by the laws of nature, but the one who created them has no problem breaking those laws. And you know, then it says this really funny thing. Jesus meant to pass by them. Now, this is such a weird little phrase, isn't it? You know, now, what's he doing here? Is he being a tricky trickster? Like, they're in the boat, and is he kind of like, no, nothing to see here, you know? Or is he just trying to beat them to the other side of the lake? You know, you're clearly struggling here with the rowing, you know? The race is on, guys, I'm going. No. And there's something that we miss here that Mark's original audience would have got really clearly. In the Old Testament, whenever it talked about God passing by, it was always God passing his glory by, his goodness by people. He was showing people who he was. There was this beautiful incident in Exodus where Moses goes up a mountain and he says, Lord, show me your glory. And God says to him, I will make all my goodness, a demonstration of my character, pass before you. And I will proclaim to you my name, the Lord. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. And so whenever God passed by people, it wasn't because he was running away from them. It's because he was demonstrating his glory in a way that would put heart in them, in a way that would encourage them. And so Jesus is coming to them on the lake to give them a demonstration of who he is. He's saying, this is who I am. You know, you're all familiar with your Old Testaments, guys in the boat. You should know this. I'm coming to pass by you with my glory. I'm coming to show you who I am, and I'm going to proclaim to you my name. And his attempt to encourage them is scuppered by the disciples. He's saying to them, can you see yet? Now, what's the first conclusion that they come to from the evidence that's before them? Quick flashback. They've been on mission. They've watched people get healed. They've watched people be delivered. They've watched people be responding to the good news of the kingdom. They've seen 5 loaves and 2 fish feed thousands of people. What is the first conclusion that they come to when Jesus is walking on the water? It's a ghost. Now, there's a long and rich history of God's people responding to revelations of God's goodness like this, and I include myself in that. I include us in that. Do you know, it almost feels like God does amazing things among us. 30 minutes later, some crisis blows up, and our faith of that moment is swallowed up by our present circumstances, and we forget how faithful he has been. In Exodus 15, which I think is probably one of the most incredible water-based miracles that's ever happened on the face of the earth. I'm sticking with water-based miracles for the first part of this, just so you should see there's a theme here, okay? Moses stands, stretches out his arm over the Red Sea parts, God's people walk through on dry ground, Red Sea closes, the opposing army is utterly destroyed. Praise be. Isn't God amazing? Isn't he wonderful? 3 days later, they're in the desert and they're like, oh, we've got no water. Now, bear in mind, water-based miracle. Can God not do another water-based miracle to give them some water to drink? And instead, they're like, why did you bring us out into the wilderness to die? Like, you're just going to kill us. Like, he's just saved their life in the most incredible way, and he's going to kill them. Seriously. But I wonder, how much am I like this? And church, this is where testimony is so important. There's another water-based miracle in Joshua where God brings his people into the promised land, and he kind of reenacts what he's done at the Red Sea. The water parts, they walk through on dry ground. But he tells them this time, pick up a load of stones from the riverbed and put them on the other side of the river. And these stones are reminders. These are a testimony. This is what God did. Remember. And so when you come and you give testimony, you're placing down a stone that reminds somebody this is who God is and this is what he's like. This is what he's doing. And so that testimony is so important. It's such an encouragement to the rest of us, because you never know. The testimony that you're giving when you come and share. It may well be that someone else is here that you don't know their circumstances, and yet that's the stone that they need to look at to say, oh, that's who he is. That's what he's like. Lord, give me confidence. And so it's so important so that we see and we don't forget. Anyway, let's go back to the disciples. So the disciples are terrified, but they're terrified by Jesus this time. And Jesus has just attempted to encourage them by drawing a direct line between Yahweh in the Old Testament and himself now. And they've ruined it. And how many times have you tried to do something nice for people and then they ruin it and you go, oh, that was stuff you done? And Jesus just toddles off to the other side of the lake and he's out, find your own way home. Like, he doesn't do that. Look at his response. I love the heart of Jesus. Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. He speaks courage into their circumstances. But even here, there's something bigger that we are missing. Because actually, the translation of this is, take heart. I am. Do not be afraid. The problem is that, when an English translator translates the Bible, to translate that, they're like, that's not very readable, is it? But remember, Moses went up the mountain. God said, I'm going to make all my goodness pass before you, and I'm going to tell you my name. I am. Jesus is making his glory pass before them on the lake, and he's saying to them, I am. Like, who's on the water? Who is on the water with you people? This is God himself who has come to you. Can you see it yet? Can you see? It's like he's holding up the magic eye and he's saying to them, can you see yet? Like, you're not squinting hard enough. And yet he gives them more opportunity. The evidence is just kind of stacking up. And this time Jesus doesn't speak to the storm, but instead he speaks to the storm in the boat. He speaks to the storm that's going on in the disciples. And he gets into the boat. And did you catch that in the story? He got into the boat. Everything was calm. Everything was calm. All of a sudden. And the disciples are sat in the boat, and because they know their Old Testament, they know their Hebrew Bible, they know from the Psalms that there is only one whom the wind and the waves obey. They know that this is God in the boat. And they are utterly astounded. They are exceedingly, abundantly astounded. They are removed from their place of standing. They are literally out of their minds. But here's the issue. They're utterly astounded, not because they recognize that this is God in the boat. They're astounded because they still don't see it. They still don't get it. They're rendered senseless. They've got no spiritual perception. It's like, can you see yet? Well, no. And that's the repeated theme throughout Mark's gospel. Time and time again, the disciples just don't see it. They miss the point that this whole miracle with the loaves was meant to point them to the fact that they were in the presence of power. They were in the presence of love. They were in the presence of God. They were meant to see that this one that they're with is Lord of all. This is the King. This is Messiah. He's come. But they don't get it. And there's another little kind of detail in the text as well. It feels like Mark's having a poke at the disciples. They were going to Bethsaida for their little retreat. But the text tells us they didn't actually land there. They landed at Gennesaret. Was their little trip in the boat successful? No, they were blown totally off course. And it feels like Mark is saying not only were they blown off course in the boat, but actually they'd been blown off course inside as well. They just weren't seeing who Jesus was. And yet, time and again over these next weeks, we're going to see Jesus in his kindness taking them through kind of almost like repeat miracles. It's like, well, if you didn't get the loaves first time round, should we have a rerun of the loaves? They'd had one boat experience. Well, here's another boat experience. And it feels like in his kindness, he just repeats the same things over and over again. And do you know what, church? He does the same for us. When we're slow on the uptake, he'll teach us the lesson again because he's kind and he's gracious and he's good and he wants us to see him and to know him. Now, the last part of this little story feels like we're being confronted with a contrast. They get out of the boat and they're still not going to have their spa break because there's another crowd. And it's another pesky crowd that's come to annoy them, and yet they're not annoying Jesus. And do you know what I love about this crowd? These crowds are a contrast to the disciples. They haven't seen everything that Jesus has shown the disciples, but they know enough to know that Jesus is worth running to. They know that there's power here. They know that Jesus is worth coming to. And so all the surrounding villages, and let's just try and picture the scene here, right? All the sick people in villages all around. Word of mouth goes out. No Facebook, no TikTok, no mobile phones. This is all word of mouth that's spreading out. And then people are bringing their sick from all over the place. And they don't have 4x4s to stick the stretchers in the back. This is strap them to the back of a donkey or carry them on a mat. They know enough to know that Jesus is worth bringing their sick people to. And it might well be that their understanding of who Jesus is a little bit shallow and superficial, and they're looking for a transaction at this point. They just want healing rather than transformation. But the fact is that they still know enough to come. They know enough to bring their loved ones to Jesus. And you think about the contrast to Nazareth a few weeks back, where the people were cynically unbelieving. They didn't want the work of Jesus in their area, and they rejected him, and so Jesus didn't do many miracles there. And yet here, there's an invitation, there's expectation, there's anticipation, there's desire, and that is met with the compassionate action of Jesus. And you see all of these people getting healed. And Jesus is dressed in kind of traditional Jewish get-up, and he's got tassels on his garments. And they're laying people out so that if these people can only get just the lightest touch on these tassels as he walks past, they're going to be healed. Such is their expectation of what Jesus can do. And as many as touched it were made well. And I feel like there's a sense in which Mark is kind of making Jesus break the fourth wall and turn and ask us the question, can you see yet? Can you see? Like the people in Gennesaret, have we seen enough of Jesus to bring it all to his feet? And here's what I've been really challenged by this week. And so this might just be me, in which case, you'll just go home, and because you're clearly in a far better place than I am. But this has been a real challenge to me this week. I was thinking, Lord, have I seen enough to know to bring it all to your feet? And I felt like this question popped into my mind. What's your default in crisis? When a big crisis blows up, how do you respond to this? And do you respond first of all like the disciples, who you're confronted with a big logistical issue? There's something that you just can't do. You don't have the resources to do it, and you're saying, how on earth can we do this, Lord? And he's saying, surely the question should be, how in heaven am I going to do this? And And I feel like that's a challenge to us. Do we dive straight to the practical solution, or do we come to him saying, what does this situation look like through your eyes, Lord? Or do we do like the disciples in the boat and dive straight to, it's a ghost, get into panic mode? Like there's no way anything is going to happen, anything good is going to happen here. Or do I come to him? Do I bring it all to him? What do we see most clearly? Do we see the crisis that we're in, or do we see Jesus that stood with us? And this is why this rhythm of prayer is so vital. Thinking back to last week, if he is our good shepherd, right? Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want for anything. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. That being led beside still waters and the sitting on the green grass, that kind of speaks to the peaceful times of life, doesn't it? It speaks to the mundane moments of life. And if we're walking with him in the peaceful moments of life, then we know that when the dark valleys come, we can trust him because we know who he is. We've been walking with him. And I love the example of George Muller. And if you've never heard of George Muller, I know some of you are like massive George Muller fanboys and fangirls. But if you've never heard of George Muller, then you should become a fanboy or fangirl, because like George Muller was awesome. He set up a bunch of orphanages, and he did it all by faith. Never asked anybody for anything. Never made his needs known. He just prayed. And there's this beautiful story where one morning the orphanage that he's in has no food and no money to buy food. And George doesn't do the whole, how on earth are we going to feed these kids? Like, we're going to need 200 denarii to feed these kids, He doesn't ask that question. Instead, he says to the kids, well, come and see what God will do. And you just think that's a wild statement to make. And then he goes a step further and he gathers the kids around the table to pray, to give thanks for the food that they are about to receive, the currently non-existent food. And they pray, and George Muller says, Dear Father, I thank you for what you are going to do. Knock on the door. There's a baker. And the baker has turned up because the baker was awoken at 2 a.m. with the conviction that he needed to bake a load of bread for these kids. Not only did they have bread, but Muller said, Father gave us fresh bread. Then there's another knock at the door. A milk truck has just broken down outside, and the milk truck isn't refrigerated, and there's no way of getting that milk to anywhere else that it needs to be, so the guy on the milk truck gives them the milk, and George Muller says, wow, milk as a bonus. Isn't that amazing? George Muller was just a man, and I love what Simon Hawley says about him. He says, Muller's heart had so changed, his mind had so shifted, that his first default response when presented with a massive problem was, let's see what the Father will do. Instead of spiraling into self-pity or hurrying into activity and self-reliance, Muller's transformed mind saw this difficulty as an opportunity for the Father to demonstrate his goodness. He knew that the source of everything that he needed was not himself, but his Father. I so want to see Jesus so clearly, and I want to see him clearly beside still waters, and I want to see him clearly on the green pastures. I want to see him clearly before the crisis comes. I want to know that he is trustworthy in the mundane, because he is then trustworthy in the dark valleys. He is the good shepherd. He is the glorious I am. He is God with us. He is God for us. He's God over the waters, bringing order to our chaos. He is God bringing light to our darkness, healing to our brokenness, life to our death, forgiveness to our sin. And if this is who he is, then how can we not give ourselves back to him? And so that's the God that we want to see in the mundane moments of life. But you know what? In his grace and in his kindness, he uses the choppy waters. He uses the crises. He uses the lack of loaves and the lack of fish to show us who he is. Because that's just who he is. And so whether the crisis, if you're in a green pastures, still waters moment, I praise God for that. I really do. But the reality is that most of us at some place in our lives have a little bit of choppy waters or missing loaves and fish going on. Is that fair to say? But whether the crisis that we're in is one of sin, stuff, situations, or sickness, the reality is that he calls us to run to him and to bring it to him. If the crisis is sin, that is our greatest crisis. There is no greater crisis because sin separates us from God. It cuts us off from the one who is the source of life. And he wants us to come and to have life. And Jesus has dealt decisively with our sin. At the cross, Jesus deals with our sin. He deals with the death that comes with it. He dies in our place, but he rises to new life, and he invites us to place faith in him. He invites us to give him our allegiance and to experience life in him. And if you never have, then do it. Why wouldn't you? Seriously. But if the crisis that you're walking through is one of a situation that you cannot see the resolution to, or if it's a need for a resource that you're lacking, bring it to him. Run to him. Bring it to the feet of Jesus, and remember that those are feet that can walk on water. But as we come to a close this morning, as we come to respond, there's been one thing that has been particularly on my heart this week. If your need today is sickness, a body that is broken, then we believe that by the power of his Spirit, through his people, Jesus still heals. Now, what I'm not going to do is stand up here and say, if you come forward for prayer, I guarantee 100% you're going to be healed. Because Jesus has taught me to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I'm in submission to the will of the Father. We all have to be in submission to the will of the Father. But here's what I do know. James, the brother of Jesus, says, you do not have because you do not ask. Or to put it in more kind of now speak, you don't ask, you don't get. And he calls us to come and to ask. And I want to encourage you this morning. What is the absolute worst that can happen? The absolute worst is that you get prayed for and nothing in your body changes. But because of the love of God through his body ministering to you and through the power of the Spirit in your body, you experience the love of God and you experience his witness because he has promised to be with you. That's the absolute worst that can happen. What is the best that can happen? There's coming a day when all things will be made new. All of our bodies will be renewed. Everything will be made new. And he loves to give moments where he breaks in from that day, from the not yet, into the now. And he loves to bring healing into our bodies. And I've experienced it both ways. I had 7 years where I couldn't eat food, proper food, and it was known as the dust diet. And, because that was pretty much it. You go around to somebody's house and they'd say, oh, we can't give you gluten, we can't give you this, we can't give you that. And that was 7 years. God stepped in. He spoke through somebody, and he healed my body. But for the last 20 years, I've had a wonky left side. Now, I know it doesn't look particularly wonky to you, but I've got something going on in my brain. And I didn't know what it was that was going on in my brain. I thought I was having a stroke. Regularly, I thought I was having a stroke. And it took 20 years. And I've been prayed for so many times. Like so many people have prayed that this wonkiness would go away. I know what it is now. I've got a diagnosis. I can live with it. I still have a wonky left side. But you know what I've experienced through all of those moments where I've been prayed for and where I've been prayed with? I've experienced the compassion and the love of Jesus and the witness of Jesus through his people. That's the worst that can happen. The best that can happen is that he steps in and he heals our broken bodies. So here's what we're going to do this morning.